Ollie Lennard, aka Oliver Thorne, aka Philosophy Tube. And what's been coming down his tube? Not just philosophy, Marxism, economic theories, and a commentary on a video I made with my friend, the Golden One, on the subject of traditionalism. Now, he used this in the context of a video where he was critiquing Steve Bannon and a whole load of other things, which I'm not really interested in talking about. And it's a very long video, it's about 45 minutes long, so I'm only going to talk about the middle part, which is where he addresses a video I made. And since that video only really discusses two things: one, the traditionalist school and what it's about, and secondly, the Cheddar Man fiasco with the media circus surrounding it, and the deceptive way that science was reported. I'll start with Cheddar Man, 10,000-year-old skeleton from Britain, which belongs to a race of people that geneticists refer to as Western hunter-gatherers. And these skeletons have been found all over Europe, Western Europe, from Spain up into Britain and Sweden, and they are generally a sort of a genetic group that formed somewhere around the Mesolithic, and then were replaced with the incoming of farming in the Neolithic. Basically, modern Europeans have inherited a lot of their blood, and they're a lot like modern Europeans, except one specific aspect: they didn't have brown eyes. All of them have blue eyes. The brown eyes were brought in later by the Neolithic farmers. And another thing brought in by the Neolithic farmers were genes associated with the complexions we now associate with Europeans. These are absent in Western hunter-gatherers, which has led some scientists to assume that perhaps these people had darker complexions. Can't say exactly how dark, and Ollie correctly recognises that I'm correct in saying that. But the point of the video wasn't to say that the scientists were wrong, because I know that the scientists were right. We were criticising the way the media reported him as a sub-Saharan African, which is absolutely not true. And Ollie didn't really address that fact, and actually seemed to excuse people like Afua Hirsch, who specifically referred to him as a black man, when he was not a black man. In the video, I said to Marcus that I thought this media campaign had been engineered and scientists had encouraged it, knowing that it was a false narrative, because they wanted to encourage the disassociation of modern British people with the prehistoric inhabitants of the island, and thereby disrupt senses of belonging. Ollie said, "Have you got a source on that?" He said correctly that I didn't actually have a source, but what's stated right at the beginning of that video is that there was no plan for that video. He came over for a cup of tea and we turned the camera on and started chatting. And I don't carry scientific sources in my pocket when I'm going to have a cup of tea with a friend. So no, I didn't bring up the sources, but of course there are sources, and I'm going to show them to you now. One of the scientists who advised the people who made the facial reconstruction was Tom Booth from the Natural History Museum. And in the year before the Cheddar Man fiasco began, he released an article in conjunction with people from UCL, and it reveals his biases and that he has a vested interest in preventing the reporting of ancient DNA from reinforcing senses of identity, which he believes feeds into white nationalist narratives, or even encouraging the plague of our times, Brexit.
Archaeologists need to understand that the complex information contained within news, popular and academic articles in the public domain is being misinterpreted, misused, and used to uphold ultra-racist political beliefs within complex social contexts online. The complicated association between present ethnic identity and ancient DNA is misunderstood, oversimplified, and frequently used to fit into nationalist narratives and support ideas of white supremacy.
Ollie correctly identifies that this study suggested an entire range of complexions that could have possibly been had by Cheddar Man and his people, the WHG, aka Western Hunter-Gatherers. But in the context of the video I made with Marcus, the actual complexion of Cheddar Man is irrelevant. We weren't talking about his actual complexion because we can't say that yet. We were talking about the way they chose specifically to go with the darkest possible complexion that could exist, and then secondly, to report on that in a way that misled ill-informed members of the public into believing that the original inhabitants of the British Isles were sub-Saharan Africans, which is not true. As I said in the video, originally Europe was populated quite homogeneously with a single basic population of hunter-gatherers that geneticists call Western hunter-gatherers. And whether you take a sample of one of these from Spain or Britain or anywhere else in Western Europe, it's pretty much the same. There's not a great deal of genetic drift. There's some, but they all form one genetic cluster.
There's no living population on Earth today that is exactly in that cluster. They're very close to modern Europeans, and they're closer to Northern Europeans than to Southern Europeans, because Northern Europeans today have more genetic similarity, more descent from the original indigenous hunter-gatherers of Europe than Southern Europeans do. No other race in the world has any genetic affinity with them except Europeans. None at all.
So we can confidently say Western hunter-gatherers are European people. They're just an archaic type. They have European-shaped nose, European brow ridges, European straight hair. Everything European, but perhaps a darker complexion. That was back in 2018, and it wasn't an isolated incident. And it proves what I was saying, that this is part of a concerted effort to misrepresent prehistoric inhabitants of Europe, specifically Britain in this case, for a political end. Look at what's happened on Swedish state television just now. They've got a program about prehistoric inhabitants of Sweden, including Western hunter-gatherers. And look how they've cast the actor for a Western hunter-gatherer. An actor of sub-Saharan African origin. Of course, this is not an accurate portrayal. Even if he did have the complexion of a sub-Saharan African, which we don't know, we know that he didn't have the facial and cranial morphology of a sub-Saharan African like this actor does. All they've done is put blue contact lenses on a black guy, which is basically the equivalent of blackface. And it's so far from accurate in a scientific and historical sense that it can only have one purpose: to mislead people. As I said, the Western hunter-gatherers were replaced by another population who brought in lighter complexions, and these were called the Neolithic farmers. They came in from Anatolia and mixed with the Western hunter-gatherers of Europe to form what we call Neolithic Europeans. And Neolithic Europeans were genetically almost identical to the modern inhabitants of the highlands of Sardinia. And, lucky for us, they've made recently at the Museum of Brighton a reconstruction of a Neolithic European. And since we know that these people were European in their complexion, and they must have had a complexion that corresponds to some modern Europeans, even if they were Southern Europeans, and since our friend from the Natural History Museum in London, Tom Booth, has helped out with this reconstruction in Brighton, which they call the White Hawk Woman, we can be quite confident that he'll make sure they get the complexion right, won't they? Oh dear. That almost seems like a concerted effort, like a plan to make them darker than they really were, doesn't it? Or perhaps that's just a right-wing conspiracy theory I made up. Now we're going to move to the main point of the video, and it was the main point of the original video which Ollie was actually commenting on, and that's religion, specifically the Traditionalist school. Ollie correctly describes the Traditionalist school as a school of religious comparative study which looks at ancient and global religions and traditions to look at what is perennial and common to all of them, to understand that they all derive from one truth. I'm very much influenced by the Traditionalist authors, particularly René Guénon, who was the founder of the school, and Julius Evola, who's the subject of this video. However, these men had significant disagreements with each other on certain points, and so did all the others of the Traditionalist school. And I'm not even sure whether you could call me a Traditionalist, because I differ on some major points of that school, but it's certainly true to say that I'm very much influenced by it in my religion. Ollie has no religion. However, he did make a video where he explains a quite enlightened perspective on religion for an atheist.
I don't believe in the truth of any religion's central claims, and so I don't personally see the point for me of living those questions, but it's still cool to appreciate other people's viewpoints.
Great. I'm glad to hear that, Ollie. But is it really true that you take this open-minded approach when analysing the work of an expert on ancient religions, such as Julius Evola?
It's possible to take a very surface-level reading of Evola, according to which he is just a traditionalist.
No. According to a detailed reading of all his actual work, you can come to an understanding of his position in relation to the Traditionalist school and, more importantly, the ancient traditions which he references. A surface reading of Wikipedia makes it possible to typify him as merely a hater of women and a lover of fascism, and completely disregard a lifetime of work in comparative religious studies, which you don't really even touch on in this video.
It matters what those traditions are, and it matters who gets to pick them.
But Evola does not pick them. The criteria by which a tradition is identified as traditional with a capital T is determined by the school itself. They must be perennial. They must be common to many cultures, not something that has arisen as a divergence from primordial tradition. It's impossible for someone to claim to be a traditionalist and then defy that without being called up on it. You can't just randomly pick a tradition that is unique to one area or one era and then call it perennial, because it isn't. So there's not some random person just choosing according to his modernistic whims. So when Marcus says we need to pick something according to our perspective as Europeans, he isn't saying that we should take a modern approach from a modern experience of being as Europeans and then select something that we like, cherry picking elements of ancient traditions to form a chimera for the modern age. And I can see why you thought that, but you have to understand the context. Both Marcus and I are pagans, and actually the traditionalist school looks down on this, because according to traditionalism, while there's transcendental unity of all religions, old and new, you have to choose one tradition. You have to choose one and follow it to the letter, even though you recognize that other religions also have truth. You're not allowed to mix them together. And from their perspective, the only valid traditions now are those which have an unbroken line of tradition going back throughout history. And because paganism doesn't have that, we would be seen as heretical to the orthodoxy of the traditionalist school. That's why perhaps you can't really call Marcus or I traditionalists. However, I believe that there is a valid pagan tradition and that it can be recovered, but practicing European paganism in the context of Sophia Perennis requires one to look at the transcendental unity of religions and pick those elements from all different traditions that are derived in part from European paganism and take those back to reconstruct European paganism as it was. So that's what Marcus was talking about, not just using a modern perspective, but actually using what we know about historical religion to understand it and practice it in the modern times. And in the process, being informed by the wisdom of the traditionalist school, but not following it to the letter as a doctrine.
Because there is no neutral history, there can be no untainted traditionalism that doesn't contain some of the values of the present being projected back.
That's an interesting point, Ollie, and I agree. As far as it is impossible to be a neutral observer, there is no true objectivity. But once again, you operate under the assumption that the criteria by which the primordial tradition is identified is contingent on the personal biases of an individual and not by the basic rule, which is that it is a perennial tradition that is found in multiple traditions independently throughout time and space. Instead of approaching the traditionalist school and understanding it on its own terms, you have approached it and tried to understand it through critical theory. In the next section of the video, Ollie discusses what he calls Evola's concept of the hierarchy of races, but he doesn't actually show any quotes where Evola discusses a hierarchy of races.
A person is endowed with a certain spirit by virtue of being born in a given caste, but at the same time, one is born in a specific caste because one possesses, transcendentally, a given spirit.
Now that quote is presented in Ollie's video as a discussion of race, but it is not. It is not a discussion of race. It comes from chapter 14 of Julius Evola's magnum opus, Revolt Against the Modern World, and that chapter is called On the Doctrine of the Castes. Now, caste systems, as Evola identifies at the beginning of the chapter, actually exist in many, many cultures, but he says that it's most clearly elucidated in the Vedic systems from India, the Vedic religion, which became what we call Hinduism today, and that's why he discusses that mainly. But why didn't you know that, Ollie? Why didn't your researchers know that? Like, it's really clear in the whole chapter, it's a discussion of caste, not races. In fact, the only thing you'd have to do to know that is read the title of the chapter. Now, I'm not trying to say that Evola didn't believe there was a hierarchy of races. He may very well have done so, but he doesn't write about that in the book, and that quote certainly doesn't discuss it either. And it's also not possible for anyone to argue that the caste system is unique only to India, because we can see exact parallels even in Scandinavia for the Old Norse text Riksula, which describes the different castes of man from the highest to the lowest being created separately, but fathered by one God among different types of people and having different physical characteristics and different tendencies, being suited for different types of lives. Just the same as in India. Now, neither the Indian nor the Nordic version of caste mentions race either. So why are you even bringing race into this? Evola is pretty much orthodox on his view of caste. It's very much in line with Coomaraswamy and Bannon, etc. Except there is one crucial thing that Bannon and Evola disagreed upon on the doctrine of caste, and that was about the role of the highest caste, which Bannon said had to be ultimately derived from the priestly caste, because the role of the soldier, according to Bannon, must be subservient to that of the priestly caste. Evola disagreed with this, and they wrote back and forth, arguing about it a bit. I personally side with Bannon. I think the priestly caste is supposed to be the highest. I think that's quite obvious, and I have done a video where I quote Bannon on the subject of caste.
Errors of application are no doubt always possible, especially in periods when the light of tradition has grown dim, but they do not in any way affect the validity of the principle, and it can be said that to deny it implies theoretically, if not always in practice, the overturning of every legitimate hierarchy. At the same time, it can be seen how absurd is the attitude of those Europeans who feel indignant because a man cannot pass from his own caste into a higher one. In effect, this would imply nothing more nor less than a change of individual nature, or in other words, a man would have to cease being himself in order to become another man, which is obviously absurd. A being will remain throughout the whole of his individual existence what he is potentially at the time of his birth. The question why a being is himself and not another is a pointless one. The truth is that every being, each according to his own nature, is a necessary element in the total and universal harmony.
I don't want to be accused of trying to sanitize Evola and claiming he didn't have theories on race, because he did, but they weren't actually mentioned in Ollie's video. So I'll discuss them here instead. Now, Evola agreed with the general perspective on what race is, which is that there is a physical component to race, races of the body, he calls them. But he also had another conception of race based on the soul. Evola recognizes that all humans share the essential same mental predispositions, and that these derive in part from their experience of being in the world as a human being. But these tendencies are expressed in different ways by different peoples, and the style in which these are expressed is what Evola calls the race of the soul. Now, according to this doctrine, one could be physically one race, but spiritually another. You know, like you could look white, but you could be spiritually black. Remind you of anyone in the modern world? Another of the main accusations that Ollie launches against Evola is that he was a misogynist. But is that right?
Not my soggy knees.
To be born male, you first have to be transcendentally male. To be born female, you first have to be transcendentally just a piece of shit.
Okay, I know that you were actually joking when you said that, but it was still misrepresenting Evola's position, even if it was being done humorously and maybe ironically. I can't tell to what extent you really think that's Evola's position. You kind of imply that Evola believes that an essential component of the whole can be devalued, which is impossible, right? Say I have a car, and one essential component is tires. Another essential component is a drive shaft. What's superior, the tires or the drive shaft? It's a stupid question because the car's useless without either. And Evola's position is that to be superior is not to be the tire or the drive shaft, but be the perfect tire or the perfect drive shaft. So a perfect tire is superior to a faulty drive shaft, and a perfect drive shaft is superior to a bald and raggedy old tire. Once again, we're looking back in time and trying to understand ideas about gender that aren't really popular anymore. Feminism is a modern ideology. It did not exist in any traditional culture. So whenever you project a feminist viewpoint back in time, you are distorting the past and preventing yourself from fully understanding the point of view of those people. It doesn't really matter in this context whether you agree with those positions or not. If you're a scholar and you're trying to understand another point of view, you have to try and discard the biases that you have. And obviously that's not always entirely possible, but first recognizing you have those biases is important, because then you can try to look from another perspective. If your only perspective on ancient Rome, the Incas, the early Islam, is how well they adhere to modern gender equality laws, then you're not really engaging with those cultures and you're not getting anywhere close to understanding them. Now, Ollie correctly identifies that gender roles in traditional societies were based on the principle of devotion. Men devote their bodies to God, to the transcendent principle, either through war, in which they disregard their own lives, or perhaps as an aesthetic. In the same way they disregard their desire to eat, their desire to have sex. All earthly passions are disregarded in a devotional act. Now, similarly, there is a female equivalent, and that is in devotion to another through a husband. There's also devotion to a god. You have temple custodians, you have women who devote themselves to a goddess or a god, and they give up earthly passions like the male aesthetic, or you have women who, through their devotion to their husband or Lord, are really devoted to a god. Whether it's female devotion or male devotion, it's actually the same principle of devotion and of disregard for the material. Now, this expression of piety through devotion is completely at odds with a materialist viewpoint. And if you accept the materialist conception of history that Marx has presented, then obviously you can only recoil in horror, because why don't these women care more about making money and getting rich or whatever, or having sex with loads of guys, or whatever things you think are really important for women to do. But you have to remember those weren't considered important in traditional societies. And if you're trying to look at a perennial tradition that is common to all traditional societies, you can't expect to find modern values. I can understand why you'd like to reject those historical perspectives, but may I just say that I think that you're doing yourself a disservice in doing so. And one of the most beautiful examples in history where it has been presented is in Hinduism, in the goddess Parvati, who's also known as Sita in another form. She's the wife of Shiva, and the story of her devotion as a form of piety is so beautiful and such a rich part of human heritage that just discard it as misogyny. You're limiting your own intellectual horizons and your ways of seeing, and preventing yourself from enjoying such a beautiful perspective on being that has been vital to the growth of one of the oldest civilizations in history, that of India. Ollie said that Marcus looks at traditionalist principles and chooses whether or not he wishes to accept them based on the values he already has. Now, that's precisely what you've done, Ollie, when you've uncritically adopted the perspective of critical theory, which is the homogeneous ideological perspective that pervades academia in the West today. And you've just applied it and used it as a criteria to judge ancient perspectives of being and ancient ideas about gender. Now, as we already said, there is no true objectivity, but I just wish to demonstrate that there's hypocrisy here.
It's still cool to appreciate other people's viewpoints.
Evola didn't actually hate women. In fact, he specifically warns against what he perceived as misogyny in other writers who he sometimes cited in his work, making sure people take a different perspective on gender. He believed all men and women contain within them both a masculine and a feminine spirit, and that in each individual, one of these dominates the other, and this affects their behavior. Whichever side is dominant determines whether they're a masculine or a feminine person, but both must exist in each individual.
Cases of full sexual development are seldom found. Almost every man bears some traces of femininity, and every woman residues of masculinity. The traits that we deem typical for the female psyche can be found in man as well as women, particularly in regressive phases of a civilization.
Next we come to the accusation that Evola was heavily involved not only in Italian fascism, but also in National Socialist Germany. But is that true? After the Second World War, Evola was put on trial for accused involvement with the fascist regime of Italy, but he was acquitted. He was found not guilty, because he wasn't even a member of the fascist party. And in fact, he often described himself as an anti-fascist, and in the trial itself he called himself a super-fascist, or super-fascisti, which was a source of great amusement for Ollie in his video doing an impression of a Super Saiyan from Dragon Ball Z. However funny that might be, it's not really understanding the word super in Latin meaning over. So it's like when Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch used to originally be translated literally into English as Superman. Super, Uber, they both mean over. But of course, Superman sounded silly because of the comic book character. So you can't have Superman and Super Saiyan and then also philosophical concepts with the word super anymore because people make silly jokes. So super fascist just means above fascism, or not a fascist, basically beyond fascism. Despite initial praise from Mussolini, who actually quite liked Evola's idea of the race of the soul, he later didn't like Evola so much, and a lot of other fascist top brass took a disliking to Evola. Evola actually had to go into hiding at times and was reputed to have jumped out of a window when authorities came looking for him. So hardly heavily involved with fascism. If anything, he was seen as an enemy at times anyway. What Evola liked about fascism was its potential for a people to be able to participate in a supernatural order, one based on the principles of hierarchy that are found in ancient traditions. And when fascism failed to deliver that, he didn't like it anymore. He only liked what fascism potentially could become, which was something he wanted, not what fascists wanted. As for National Socialism, he had even less involvement than he did with the fascists. His only interest in National Socialism was in the SS, not in the actual party itself of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Just the SS, and only the SS, for one reason, because he hoped it might become a transcendent religious order like the chivalrous knight of the Middle Ages. But it didn't, and Evola was not a big part of National Socialism in any way. He wasn't even involved in any government activities, and he wasn't involved in the SS, which is something he wrote about, and only in the context of its potential. It should be added that the Gestapo had a dossier on Evola. They were keeping an eye on him. They described him as a danger, because they didn't like his ideas. He certainly wasn't welcome in Nazi Germany. So to describe him as heavily involved in German National Socialism is just not true. And although he had some racial theories, they did not correspond with German racial theory at all, and he actually wrote against some of those. And he has also condemned what he described as vulgar anti-Semitism. So once again, just brushing over and calling him heavily involved with National Socialism and fascism is really a distortion of the truth. Am I misrepresenting Evola now? Am I stripping him of context?
You strip Evola of all of that context and pretend neutral history is possible, you can present this watered down version where he's just a traditionalist. And here's the real kicker, if anybody then comes to you and tries to bring up that relevant context, you can accuse them of just poisoning the well, of being a biased, virtue-signalling SJW who's afraid of new ideas, and they won't debate you on Evola's terms.
But Evola is a traditionalist. That is the correct context. And there is no context to Evola that can prevent him from being a traditionalist. None of the traditionalists were fascists, and only one of the traditionalists, Julius Evola, had any association with fascism, and that was tenuous and only for a limited amount of time for his career. It is true to say that Mussolini liked Evola more than Evola liked Mussolini, and that later on, Mussolini didn't like Evola anyway. So, can I accuse you of poisoning the well? Yes, I can, because that's precisely what you are doing, Ollie. You are absolutely correct to say we should not cherry-pick traditions that suit us according to modern criteria and then bring them into the modern world to construct some chimerical, made-up modern religion that we claim is traditional. Absolutely agree with you there. But that's not what I'm doing. That's not what Marcus was doing. We're trying to reconstruct the Indo-European aspects of the perennial tradition to come to the primordial truth within it. And in that sense, we're indebted to the traditionalist school, although I am not technically an orthodox traditionalist. I'm a pagan. That's my religion. If you wish to discuss Evola on his own terms, as you say, you must discuss him within the context of the traditionalist school and that perspective. The cherry-picked and misrepresentative examples of Evola in your video do not form a coherent worldview to argue against. They represent neither Julius Evola nor traditionalism in general. Fascism, from my perspective, was just a political ideology. It came and it went. Traditionalism has enduring relevance because it's not based on the ideals of one people at one time in one place. It's about what is perennial to mankind and therefore more likely to pertain to transcendental truth, pure metaphysics. Now, many of the other aspects of Evola's thought, which aren't just about this, such as the value of heredity, are not unique to Evola, and as you should know as a student of philosophy, were espoused by Socrates, for example. One can quite fairly claim that Evola was pursuing the legacy of Plato, as many others have, including Emperor Julian, who was an inspiration for Julius Evola. I realise Oliver only actually brought up Evola and the video where we discussed Cheddar Man as an aside in a longer video where he was discussing something entirely different, which is Steve Bannon. But in his eagerness to dismiss Steve Bannon by an association with a super fascist evil demon, he had to mischaracterise Evola and also greatly exaggerate the connection between Evola and Steve Bannon, which is what was done by the media a few years ago when suddenly, desperately, they needed some way to make Trump seem like a Nazi, so they used the link of Trump to Bannon, Bannon to Evola, and Evola then mischaracterised as someone who hates all women. It's a very, very tenuous and just anti-intellectual perspective. It completely disregards the value of traditionalism, which is really about studying religion and all kinds of religion and having quite an open mind about these different religious perspectives, which is exactly the position you advocated for in your video on religion, Oliver, and I think you should practice what you preach. This has been Survivor Dive. Thanks for watching. If you're new to my channel, you can be sure that other videos also discuss such things as paganism, Julius Evola, traditionalism, and the philosophy of religions. It's not really a political channel, although Oliver correctly identified me as a right-winger. I don't really discuss politics. I'm more interested in religion. But please click subscribe and check out some of my other videos. And if you really like it, then please become a patron, because unlike Oliver, I don't have a team of cameramen, I don't have editors, and I don't have a great deal of donors either. So I really depend on people like you to help me out. So thanks again for watching.
You're not dealing with an ordinary fascist anymore, Kakarot.